Good evening, everyone. I think I'm probably just going to get started a bit. What you're looking at is the front cover of my very battered copy of After the Planners. After 50 years, it's just about holding together in one piece. I'm going to just move it over, my phone over, and turn for you to see me. There we are. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Stephen Hill. I'm a planning and development surveyor, so I am slightly surprised to be here, but thank you very much, Architecture Foundation and Alicia, for the invitation. The book I've chosen is Robert Goodman's After the Planners. As you see, it's quite old now. It's about the urban crisis in American cities in the late 50s and 60s. I first read it when I was at architecture school, just after it was republished here in 1971. I think it must have made quite an impression, as I certainly began to think that I didn't want to be an architect, or at least not the kind of architect that architecture schools were trying to create. And after my year out, I did in fact go back to a career in public housing that I had already started, but this time to set up a proper client-side function for a council house building programme. When I read the book 30 years later, in 2002, I realised just how much Goodman's perspective had shaped almost everything I had done over that time. His analysis of the urban crisis and the kind of interventions needed to revitalise cities meant you had to think about a whole bundle of issues and think about them all together and all the time. Ideas about poverty, racism, social and economic injustice, the need for increased democratic participation, more localised systems of governance, community organising, direct action, professional education, professional ethics, sustainable development, equitable development, community-led housing, community ownership of land, community land trusts even. And that's crucially about all kinds of economic, social and political power. Who has it, what they do with it, and are they willing to give it up or share it? No surprises about the answer to that question. But this is no tale of times past. Just last month, Alyssa Walker was writing about the structural racism in the design and execution of the Atlanta Beltline transit system. In Urbanism Hasn't Worked for Everyone, she asks, who are we making city for? These experts? Or is it the other human beings who call that place home? I think the basic elements of Goodman's analysis of the urban crisis of 60 years ago still need addressing today. They're pretty well the same as what we now like to think of as the new post-COVID normal, and what we are going to do about our current climate and health crises, and what we might have done differently about the great financial crisis in the late 2000s, and will certainly need to do about the next one. So in relation to architecture, this bundle of issues represents the operating environment for the more recent idea of architect as spatial agent from Jeremy Till and others. And that's what this book is really about. How can built environment professionals, and by planners, Goodman meant architects, engineers, urban designers, as well as town planners, city shapers, how can we work with every kind of community to make cities more humane and democratic places to live, and what kind of professional do we need to be to do that? Goodman's style is relentlessly polemical. Some of his colleagues wondered if it wasn't too bitter. To me, he reads like a present-day investigative journalist with a mission. But it's Friday night, and I'll try to keep it as light as I can. I've chosen first a few short sections which focuses in on some of his favourite targets: architects, planners, politicians, real estate businesses. It's often said that Americans have no sense of irony. Not in my experience, but if true, Goodman is particularly un-American, with a nice line in quoting people with a fine opinion of themselves and a fine opinion of their fine opinion, in the probably forlorn hope that they might have second thoughts about what they had said or done. And then I'll finish with parts of his final chapter, the hopeful bits, towards liberation. He is not embarrassed to talk about the idea of freedom, and neither should we be. It has a soaring final flourish of the kind of professionals we all need to be. I'll just find the book. So this is from his introduction, just a little bit of what the book is about. 5 years ago, I dropped out of city planning school. At that time, I was halfway through writing a PhD dissertation about how cities should be designed. I wasn't part of the turn-on, tune-in, drop-out culture, and I had no radical political analysis of my work. I just felt I had found something better to do. Working with a number of other architects, city planners, engineers, and other specialists, I offered my services to neighbourhood groups who were usually poor and sometimes black. Since that time, I have come to realise that it was not lack of expertise that was at the root of these communities' problems. To find out what solutions were needed meant looking at why the present solutions, of which we seem to have an abundant supply, continually fail. This book is a result of that search. And what I believe emerges is an insistent pattern of arrogant and repressive programmes by many prominent and not so prominent planners, politicians and corporate leaders, usually in the cause of solving what has been called the urban crisis. The solution to this dilemma, I contend, lies not in replacing these men with better trained experts operating in the same cultural, political and economic context, but rather in effecting a radically different role for the urban expert in a radically different context. His first chapter is called With a Little Help from the Experts, and it starts with two terrific quotes. The first from Melvin M. Webber, former editor of the American Institute of Planners Journal. Apologies if I slip into a not very good American accent from time to time. The contemporary planners inherit a proud tradition of service, an egalitarian ethic, and a pragmatic orientation to betterment that are as old as the early social reform movements that spawned the profession. The marriage of the social sciences and the planning profession holds out the promise that a new level of intelligence will be merged with noble purpose in confronting the problems and the opportunities of the day. And here's a quote from a neighbourhood resident responding to the introduction of a city planner at a meeting in Boston. Uh-oh, here come the maps. To hell with urban renewal, read an enormous sign on the front lawn, all but blocking out the small house behind it. The sign, which went on to warn, "We will defend our homes with our lives," startled passing motorists. The urban renewal sign in Boston represented a small beleaguered group of poor white families protesting the city's plan to tear down their homes in order to sell the land to a private developer for luxury housing. 5 years ago, along with a few other city planners, architects and other experts, I began to work for this group. We argued their cause before government officials at a multitude of public meetings. We criticised the professional competence of the official plans and presented alternative plans that we prepared after consulting with local people. Our initial success in helping neighbourhoods stall government plans was publicised by newspapers and television. Soon, other embattled groups began asking for our services. We formed an organisation called Urban Planning Aid, and with the help of other volunteer urban experts and a small staff paid for by private foundations and government grants, we began to expand our work. It seemed we had found an important way for professional planners to be relevant to some very important social problems. But as I became more deeply involved in advocacy planning work, I began to have some serious doubts about how really significant it was all going to be. One project which took us to Boston stands out as an especially vivid microcosm of the dilemma. We had gone to Boston's redevelopment office one summer morning back in 1966 to explain why our group was helping a neighbourhood organisation oppose the city's official plan. That plan would have removed the neighbourhood in order to build a new citywide high school. Our small contingent of 4 planners made our presentation to Edward J. Logue, the agency's director, in his office overlooking the demolition and reconstruction of downtown Boston. We said neighbourhoods should be able to choose their own planners and explain that such a process would make planning much more democratic. He listened with a smile, asking only a few questions as he sat facing us from the other end of his large conference table. When we finished, his smile vanished. "So long as I'm sitting in this chair," he said, "there's only one agency doing the planning in this city, and that's this one." We tried again. Later that summer, on a hot evening, the Urban Renewal Agency held a public meeting in the neighbourhood designated for the high school construction to inform the residents about its plan. City officials, knowing that the community had already been well informed, expected violence. Riot police were stationed outside the meeting hall. But what the officials found instead was an ordered and articulate presentation of the neighbourhood's demands. Presenting statistics and maps which we had helped prepare, residents of the area were able to demonstrate how the official plan hadn't addressed itself to their needs. While residents favoured the high school, they said they also wanted a proper neighbourhood to live in. They disputed the technical studies that were offered as supposed proof that the school would need such large amounts of land, and the claims that adequate measures would be taken in relocating families. They demanded that 400 units of replacement housing be built in the same neighbourhood. Visibly affected by the neighbourhood's presentation, some members of the Renewal Board began discussions on housing. Unfortunately, they had not reckoned with Edward J. Logue, and this never happened. As effective as advocacy planning might be in shifting some planning power to low-income neighbourhoods, and even occasionally stopping some government programmes, such as a highway, these communities still have to work within constraints set by those living outside their borders and whose interests are quite different from their own. To find answers to a community's impotence to effect changes in the way its people live requires looking at a more basic and more traditional dilemma than just the lack of planning power. We have to challenge the absence of social, economic, and political power. The next section is about architects, urban designers, advocates of beauty, got a few of those around at the moment, and also the real estate business. And this is from a chapter headed The Urban Industrial Complex, Part 2, so we're quite well on into the book. At this time, many architects became urban designers and city planners overnight, investing themselves with the proper credentials for their new role. And then there's a section here called Tomorrow, the World. As urban designer, the architect sees himself as the man who dictated the design for the entire built environment. Such megalomania had strong support from the president of the American Institute of Architects. The total environment produced by architecture in the next 40 years can become greater than the golden age of Greece, surpass the glory of Rome, and outshine the magnificence of the Renaissance. Such an end is possible, provided the architect assumes again his historic role as master builder. In such a role, he must retain the basic control not only of individual buildings, but of all design involved with man-made environment. The president of the American Institute of Planners suggested that architects should come together in workshops throughout the country to evolve the approach to planning solutions adequate to meet the needs of cities of all sizes and the needs of the total environment of city and country, not only in America, but in all nations of the world. Such megavisions by the planners might be written off as artistic fancies. were it not that the liberal reformers, bent on good design and advocates of beauty, helped such concepts flourish, as did the more conservative real estate businesses willing to buy them off for the pot of gold at the end of the urban renewal rainbow. And if you complement that with the next bit, which is about a view on community, the value of community involvement. And this is a chapter headed Excess Baggage, Professionalism and Alienation. The practice of asking what the community wants, said architect Hugh Hardy, discussing a building he designed in a black ghetto, is not really helpful to the architect, except politically, or to clarify the programme. The community can only think of what it knows. It can't help the architect in his architectural problem. Since the people's ideas are narrow, according to this argument, they need more of what the professional has to offer, rationalising the status quo, because of the status quo, which simply serves to maintain the status quo. By playing the game this way, we have, as professionals, helped make it especially hard for people to develop places suited to the way they might choose to live. What design skills they might have developed have remained dormant. Meanwhile, with culture relegated to the experts, the mass of the population is left to sublimate their design potential through magazines and real estate advertisements. So, in addition to the bureaucratic maze of paper and time people must follow to create a suitable environment for themselves, they must also adapt their needs to professionals who have trained themselves to pass judgment on what other people's environments should be like. One of the guidelines set down for its members by the American Institute of Architects, the AIA, is that they participate actively in the life of their community in order to project the image of professional competence, which is basic to a popular confidence in architects. One way to strengthen this image, says the AIA, is to do volunteer work in poor neighbourhoods. After planning work for the poor became popular, especially among the more socially motivated students, it became safe for the AIA to recommend its use in image building. Nothing can more plainly show the community the profession's interest in its life and nature, said the PR guide, than this type of voluntary participation. It goes on. An effective promotion can be mounted by persuading the mayor or city council to issue a proclamation naming a given week in the year as Community Design Week. This is better than having an Architects' Week, as that appears self-interested and immediately narrows the scope of public interest. Indeed. Now he's going to have a go at politicians and policy wonks. This is a section called Enter the Technocrats. On the domestic front, there were President Kennedy's urban experts, diagnosing the ills of society and bringing forth a multitude of programmes. Epitomising the planner as a rational scientist on this front was Daniel P. Moynihan, who served under Kennedy as Assistant Secretary of Labour and later as Richard Nixon's chief advisor on urban problems. While some Liberals have criticised Moynihan for this double allegiance, by Moynihan's own definition of the expert, he really didn't have much of a problem. For Moynihan, the planner is a kind of urban doctor, and doctors obviously can heal anyone without concern for political beliefs. Behind the attitude is Moynihan's elitist belief that the poor are helpless to do anything about their problems until the politicians, led by the urban doctors, come to their rescue. The poor were not only invisible, but silent as well, said Moynihan. The poverty programme was declared not at the behest of the poor. It was declared in their interest by persons confident of their own judgment in such matters. The provision of the 1964 poverty programme that called for maximum feasible participation of the poor originated, according to Moynihan, with the professionals. The point being, said Moynihan, that professional persons made professional judgments that the poor should be involved. That is what the professions do. They know best. In this position, Moynihan had ample support from Vice President Spiro Agnew, and some of us older folk and listeners will remember Spiro Agnew as somebody with a well-turned and witty phrase, of which this is one of them. You've seen one city slum, you've seen them all. Agnew, who considered himself President Nixon's personal representative for America's cities, made Moynihan's very same point before taking office. All too often, he said, participation of the poor has been construed to mean playing both doctor and patient. But let us not confuse disclosure of symptoms as a substitute for the wisdom of trained professionals. You don't learn from people suffering from poverty, but from experts who have studied the problem. There's a section over the page here called The Doctor's Medicine, and it's about a famous memo which Moynihan sent to Nixon, suggesting a government attitude of benign neglect of black people. I'm afraid I can't actually read it, it's just grotesque. But if you've got this book, it's on page 206, and it'll make your blood run cold. Now for the hopeful bit. This is from the final chapter, Towards Liberation, and this is one of his ideas about the new profession. Having rejected the traditional role of advocate-planner within the present structure of government does not mean rejecting the expert's role in creating the liberated society. But we can begin to structure our existence in relation to our social community's needs rather than our professional community's needs. Instead of remaining the outside expert trying to resolve the conflicting needs of the low, middle, high-income metropolis or simply helping the poor, we can become participants in our own community's search for new family structures or other changing patterns of association, and participants in the process of creating physical settings which would foster these ways of life. In effect, we become part of, rather than being an outside expert, of cultural change. A step in this process is to explore and make our community aware of the causes of environmental oppression, the nature of how real estate speculation affects design, for example, and to promote the creation of alternative environmental forms. Design opportunities can be used as a way of explaining the advantages of community ownership and management of all income-producing ventures, the factories, the housing and the shopping places. The design of housing in particular could expose people to the possibilities of designing for themselves and to more communal patterns of living together. A communal building, where people share facilities and spaces, would present an alternative to the present single-family house or apartment unit, an environmental condition based on the multiple duplication of facilities, which in turn induces maximum consumption. The communal or shared environment embodies a cultural change inherently antagonistic to the capitalist tendency to expand consumer markets. And that paragraph has much to do with my enduring interest in community-led housing, co-housing, any housing that has been co-produced with the people who are going to live there. And then there's a great section here on guerrilla architecture. I can't read all of it, and there's a rather fun bit about a bus shelter with a coffee machine and a heater and flowers and all the rest of it. But I am going to talk a little bit about some housing guerrilla architecture. In what might be called guerrilla architecture, I've found that the style of action in fact plays a crucial role in determining the effectiveness of a demand. This is more clearly the case with squatters' housing in South America, and also increasingly so in the United States. In Boston, a group of low-income families recently squatted in newly renovated apartments in their neighbourhood just before the higher-income tenants were scheduled to move in. Within a month, the landlord was forced to lower the rents and the public housing agency to provide a rent subsidy for the families. In New York, similar actions have forced city agencies to make housing available for low-income people. In one case, the squatters organised under the banner of Operation Move-In. Working at night with crowbars, the people opened doors and windows of apartments scheduled for demolition. The apartments were often in quite reasonably good condition. It's true that many of the people in these apartments still face eviction, but this is a factor which must be measured against the alternative of planning and waiting for housing that will probably not happen at all. Another factor is how this direct action counters the usual feeling of hopelessness in poor neighbourhoods. The ones who were willing to come and do it were pretty strong people, said one of the squatter organisers. When they first went in, it was like they were liberated. They were exhilarated. After the initial forces of the operation, more and more people signed up on waiting lists for new squatter actions. The larger the group becomes, the more difficult it will be for the city to actually remove people without providing alternative housing. It becomes a process by which the disenfranchised become aware of their potential power when they are willing to act together. In another experience with guerrilla architecture, I've also seen the effectiveness of using direct action rather than adapting to bureaucratic techniques. In one case, working with a volunteer neighbourhood organisation and MIT architecture students, I helped design and build a squatter community on a Boston parking lot. The squatter project centred on traditional urban renewal projects in the Black and Puerto Rican section of Boston. It is an area that the urban renewal chief, our old friend Edward J. Logue, had supposedly been planning with people. Only, as it often turned out in the past, he'd been planning with a certain kind of people, homeowners and private developers. The tenants, the rooming house people, were to be relocated. Many were told they'd be relocated in the same area, but it never happened. As more and more buildings were demolished or remodelled by middle-class people taking advantage of cheap in-town locations, more and more of the lowest income people were being forced out. Finally, a group of militant neighbourhood organisations decided to stop this. On a parking lot in the urban renewal area, where several buildings had recently been torn down, the people sat in and kept cars from parking. The police arrested the demonstrators, but the next day they came back and camped on the parking lot land. Within a few hours after daybreak, the squatter community of about 100 people began to take shape. By the time police arrived, the people working with architecture students had their buildings established on the land. Tent City was proclaimed as fact. The police decided not to invade the city, which by this time began to attract more and more people from the neighbourhood. Occupancy of the parking lot lasted 4 days before the neighbourhood groups were forced to leave. But by that time, they'd won promises from the city, which eventually stopped much of the relocation until new housing was available in their own neighbourhood. It also led to the election of a neighbourhood committee to oversee the urban renewal plan, the first time in this country that such a committee was ever elected, and an agreement to turn over many city-owned and slumlord-owned buildings to low-income neighbourhood groups. Working with one of these organisations, my students and I have been able to redesign and then reconstruct several of these buildings for neighbourhood families. The style and scale of such guerrilla design process obviously won't come near to meeting the quantity of environmental needs in the country. There would have to be a more radical change in most of our institutions for this to happen. Its usefulness, however, is a strategic tactic in an ongoing struggle for change. It sometimes makes possible short-term success while often publicly opposing the need for sweeping changes in housing policies. It illustrates the only way the environmental needs of the disenfranchised will be met in our present society is through a process of struggle, and it is a process not easily co-opted by the existing institutions. And now the final section, which is really the kind of culmination and a kind of message of hope for the future. As people concerned about the creation of a better environment, and that's us, he's addressing us, the professionals, we must see ourselves committed to a movement of radical political change. It is no longer possible for us to masquerade as disinterested, objective professionals, applying our techniques with equal ease to those clients we agree with as well as those we disagree with. We are in effect the client for all our projects, for it is our own society we are affecting through our actions. By raising the possibilities of a humane way of producing places to live, by phasing out the elitist nature of environmental professionalism, we can move toward a time when we will no longer define ourselves by our profession, but by our freedom as people. Well, if anyone is still there, awake, I hope that at least that last paragraph left some of you punching the air and saying, yes. I've used it quite often in mid-career workshops on professional ethics, and students have found it captures much of what they are searching for, to describe the kind of professional they want to be and how they want to work. But it isn't what you hear in many schools of architecture or planning, and it isn't what the professional institutions say they're for. Goodman's aspiration is hard to achieve, has been hard to achieve, but at least it makes you acknowledge the compromises that will often be unavoidable, and it makes you think about how much you are falling short and what you need to try next time. As Samuel Beckett said, fail again, fail better. Good night, and thanks for listening.